our speaker tonight is Peter. So I just have here a little bit more about Peter so we can introduce him properly. So this is over the week. So here's Peter. Peter is a public policy professional who currently works as the Director of Policy in the Ontario government. He contributes to various think tanks and publications, including the Kirby Lane Center, Catholic Conscience, and the Hub, where he writes and speaks about topics at the intersection of ideas, science, public policy, and culture. Very happy that you have accepted, Peter, this challenge today. And we are looking forward to your words on this chapter 6 of this important encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. So you go ahead, Peter.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Danielle and Cecil, for inviting me. It's a real privilege. And I love speaking about Catholic social teaching. So I work in politics and political sphere, and I was attracted. I'm a convert to the faith, and I was attracted in large part by Catholic social teaching, which I like to think of as the best of all worlds in terms of political ideologies. It's not a political ideology; it's a set of principles. It's not a manual, but is very rich in this regard. So I want to start by returning to some reflections on Catholic social teaching. We heard a bit from Archbishop Lepine at the outset of this series about its history, and that it's the best kept secret of the church when it began to be formally written at the end of the 19th century. And I want to just briefly call to mind its features, as in this chapter in particular, where we focus on dialogue and friendship in society. It's good to return to the principles that ground the Pope's vision for an understanding of these concepts, as I think it brings them out in pretty stark relief. So it starts, as we know, with the dignity of the human person as Imago Dei, the image of God, and not a God who is, distant and beyond all things, but a God who is near and whose fundamental characteristic is love. For God created the world as a sheer overflowing of his goodness out of love, a gratuitous gift. And as I've said, ultimately, Catholic social teaching, it's non-ideological. It's not a political program, but a set of principles derived from an understanding of the human person and their flourishing. And we will see this very clearly in this encyclical. And so, as we know, the Pope is making a novel entry into the canon of CST, I guess you could say, with this piece. And he draws much of his inspiration from the saint that bears his papal name, St. Francis of Assisi. It's a call to fraternal openness that is the way of Christ in the gospel. He calls us to this way of fraternal charity that is marked by its joy and its simplicity. And that's what we see here, especially in a call to dialogue and friendship in society. It's not a program, it's not a bureaucratic initiative, an intellectual idea. It is, spending time being close with people, which is so simple and yet so difficult. And the Pope describes, our age, which is an age of narcissism. Our politics and social life are too often marked by polarization, loneliness, and isolation, and is a kind of shallow, pragmatic, and instrumental approach to problem solving and social interactions. And as a result, I think we see, a cynicism about the meaning of life and just this hyper-individualism where the logic of marketing and consumption prevail. And the Pope is aiming for social friendship, which is not something that's very easy to cultivate. He frequently speaks of hospitality as a way of fostering greater social harmony, but it is very seldom done today, favoring, as we do, programs, initiatives where the nature of care is that it's free and it's genuine, and it can't be substituted for a kind of curated, purchased, or sanitized alternative. And he draws attention to the fact that we fail to see that the most important things are bonds. And to form them, we don't need to hustle and bustle around. We don't need more bureaucracies or outsourced care, or as I like to joke with some of my colleagues, a ministry of friendship and family formation, which I don't know, maybe it's not too far off actually, which maybe we should wonder about. Um, and he basically says, no, we simply need to spend time in caring for and getting to know one another, listening and understanding, doing things without an agenda in a way that is just natural and oriented more to leisure and enjoyment. And this is the I think radical simplicity and of course, profound challenge at the heart of the Pope's encyclical, that, it's very exhortative, it's very aspirational, and it's something we can all do, yet we struggle with so much. So that's by way of preface. In this chapter in particular, he's focusing on dialogue and friendship in society. And so I want to start with a quote from him. Approaching, speaking, listening, looking at, coming to know and understand one another, and to find common ground. All these things are summed up in the one word dialogue. If we want to encounter and help one another, we have to dialogue. Unlike disagreement and conflict, persistent and courageous dialogue does not make headlines, but quietly helps the world to live much better than we imagine. And so, the Pope points out that it's not, as he says, a feverish exchange of opinions. It's not positioning or posturing or monologues. And so what he's really pointing to here is that it is a deeper form of communication, one that is based on listening and reciprocity, giving and receiving. And this is just so very different, I think, for those who have worked in politics, corporate communications, or the media. You'd be familiar with the norms and aims of communication today. I find, it's the utilization of techniques to carefully craft messages in ways that achieve an instrumental communications objective, which really boils down to persuasion with little regard for the virtues of sincerity or truthfulness. So much of communications aims to appeal to baser psychology to elicit a desired response, kind of even in a sub-rational way. I'm sure we're all familiar with the algorithms that, our social media feeds are based on, and search engines and what have you. And so these methods, they don't aim at truth telling, but again, carefully crafting messages with human psychology in mind and with an instrumental aim. And I think that if we look at the philosophical and the cultural presuppositions for this, we see, at its core, individualism and a utilitarian moral ethos. And the Pope notes that a number of times in the encyclical, where, the pure and sincere intentions of an actor, they're not that important, and actions are not in themselves good or bad, only the effects that they achieve, where they're understood in a kind of crude way of utility maximization. So if I'm, achieving a local objective for my company or organization, sincere, forthright, and dialogical communications are not important. Only kind of the fact of persuasion is. And so the Pope is calling us to something much deeper. And he says, authentic social dialogue involves the ability to respect the other's point of view and to admit that it may include legitimate convictions and concerns. And this is something I find so true in the realm of ideas and political worldviews. Oftentimes, they mark different points of emphasis in their organizing principles and foundational values. And though there may be considerable difference in practical approach and explanations for a given phenomenon or course of action prescribed as solutions, I think you can usually find a great deal of merit and truth in the different points of emphasis that, schools of thought, political movements, theories, or parties place on different values and principles. For example, the left in its concern for the disenfranchised and marginalized, the center more for the majority opinion, spirit of conviviality, and getting along in society, and the right variously in freedom, the value and wisdom of tradition, pursuit of excellence and merit, to name a few things. And the point is that these are all good things to varying degree, and recognizing the merit and goodness in another's perspective. It's not actually that hard to do, but of course it is practically because of pride or what have you to really, reach out and say, oh, I recognize in your perspectives, something very valuable. And the Pope is kind of drawing attention to that again, this authenticity of social dialogue and respect. And he states further, about communication and how it's changing in today's world. We're in need of interdisciplinary communication. In the globalized world, and new communications technologies open up new pathways, which is a very good thing. And I think it's good for him to emphasize this. Of course, with any change, there's opportunity and challenge. On the one hand, we are very specialized since the advent of the division of labor, hundreds of years ago. But I think it's only perhaps accelerated since then, and it affords greater depth in any given subject area, and certainly collectively, but potentially a lack of general awareness of the riches of different perspectives. And the successes of the harder sciences and the proliferation of variations of explanatory schema and the different subdisciplines mean that people tend to think in whatever they specialize in, and they reify that and they think of that as the most valid explanatory model, and failing to realize that it's only a partial perspective on reality. And I think, communications media, it facilitates greater exchange of ideas and opinions and affords opportunities for integration, but it is also creating these echo chambers and causing people to drown in information. So we have to be vigilant about these different poles. And so the Pope has here, described the features of authentic dialogue and where we can go astray, and some changes in communications landscape. And then he goes to focus on an approach to arriving at truth or agreement in social contexts. And he refers here to the concept of consensus, saying that it's not relativism in light of all of this difference. To pursue the truth, we must have a society that reflects the truth of our human dignity and submit to that truth. And this is, I think this is absolutely crucial. And he states that as we peer into human nature, reason discovers universal values derived from that same nature. It was very easy to make a lot out of the differences that people have. But really there very much is a common core that reason can arrive at, upon which to form a foundation. And indeed, it can only be strengthened with appropriate dialogue based on respect and the approach that the Pope is outlining. And he does point to this, the quality of this orientation to truth as a starting point for discourse. And allow me just a brief excursion into some philosophical trends of the past 20th century here. There was kind of a big emphasis on communication, the communicative turn in the 20th century. People like Ludwig Wittgenstein and Jürgen Habermas, for them, language and communication became the basis for grounding our claims to truth. And I just want to mention one very strong argument coming out of this tradition for the importance of truth. And it's one that describes the unavoidability, really, of the laws of reason that apply to entities in the world and rational discourse alike. And it's known as a performative contradiction, something that occurs when someone makes a claim that is undermined by other points that they make and presuppositions that they rest upon. So, for example, claiming that truth does not exist by suggesting that every truth claim is really disguised power, interest, or a socially conditioned partial perspective. This really it effectively undermines one's very conclusion to state this. Of course, you're kind of persuading in this argument that, well, I'm so clever that I've discovered this, that you should in fact listen to me. But really, it doesn't make any sense. It's a self-undermining type of claim, and I think it's very common today. But it points to the fact that you always have to assume that even what you are saying is true, and all communication and dialogue, it must be truly rationally based. And when have that in mind, you can recognize all of these sub-rational, I guess you could say, like persuasive, manipulative, insincere techniques in the realm of communication for what they are, not truthful, not aiming at the truth. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's very common today for people to look at questions of truth and agreement as questions of power and subjectivity. And it's just really a non-starter for rational discourse. It completely undermines politics and social life by emphasizing subjective preference, group identity, and social status concepts like we hear today, like lived experience. And they elevate them to epistemological primacy, whereas, in fact, they may have only practical relevance to the truth. And again, the Pope says, what is now happening and drawing us into a perverse and barren way of thinking is the reduction of ethics and politics to physics. Breakdown ensues. Everything is leveled down by a superficial, bartered consensus. So this is where he's pointed to the importance of consensus, but then it's not just any consensus. And the church has always recognized this, that the consensus or majoritarianism or simple democratic outcomes, they do not equal truth. Democratic processes is another contingent political system. It can recognize the inherent dignity of persons to participate in society, exercise their freedom, but the outcome of democratic processes, it does not equal truth, and rightly so. The truth has different standards associated with it. All that said, the Pope recognized very clearly that in a pluralistic society, dialogue is the best way to realize what always ought to be affirmed and respected, apart from this, superficial consensus. And we should indeed arrive at enduring truths that are accepted by all and go beyond mere consensus if we are really sincere in our dialogue, if we're really getting to the heart of things, if we're really plumbing the depths of being respectful, then people bring down their barriers and you can arrive at that. And if you have rational presuppositions. And he points to, I think just the wisdom of millennia as a path to enduring truths. We can see that if something always serves the good functioning of society, he says, is it not because lying beyond it, there is an enduring truth accessible to the intellect? And indeed, I think it's proof is in the pudding sometimes. And so as he's established kind of the fact that we can arrive at these basic foundational truths that are shared by all and found throughout traditions throughout history, that it doesn't result in ethical rigidity or to the imposition of a single moral system, since those universally valid moral principles, they can be embodied in different practical rules. And so there will always be room for dialogue. And I think this is a very good point, the distinction between theoretical and practical reason here, that principles are universal and they can be deliverances of reason, but practical reason, which focuses on what you should do, concrete norms for implementation, those are always a matter of prudence. And so it's right reason with respect to action, we say. It's the nature of practical reason, and it always allows for the constantly changing, unique circumstances of the situation. to determine what is fitting to do. So yes, we can recognize, universal moral principles. Yes, we can recognize foundational truths. And then practically speaking, we have to do a lot of that hard work to figure out what makes sense in a given moment and given time. And those concrete norms, embodied practices, they cannot be necessarily universalized. So there's a very appropriate diversity in society in the realm of the practical and application. So near the end of the chapter, the Pope now goes to speak about this new culture. So it's his new way of living. And he uses one of the terms that he's become very, very famous for, the culture of encounter. He says, it means working to create a many-faceted polyhedron whose different sides form a variegated unity, in which the whole is greater than the part. The polyhedron allows for tensions and disagreements to fruitfully coexist and include those on the peripheries of life. So really, again, here, the Pope is describing a way of being. It's not a political program or anything like that. It's a way of being, an encounter. And applying it to culture, a people's culture is more than abstractions. It's more than tokenistic things, all of the kind of things we know various countries or peoples for. It's their deepest desires, their interests, and ultimately the way they live their lives. And fostering this culture of encounter means being passionate about meeting people, seeking points of contact, building bridges, and it becomes an aspiration, style of life. And it aims at social peace, which, as the Pope says, demands a lot of hard work. It is not something you can, just write or create or produce. It's something that is formed over time with people and is sustained by maintaining those interactions. And I think here really we see a very stark contrast, and I would certainly include myself in this. Reading this encyclical, it's like a splash of water in the face a little bit. How to wake up and change your way of being, but very hyper busy, again, instrumentally oriented, self-absorbed. We like to quantify everything. We have a very technocratic reality. Everything needs to be measured. Do this, do that, and I just think it would be kind of funny to imagine how a government bureaucracy or a corporation would try to instill a culture of encounter. It would basically kill it by its own methods. It would create rules and require people to, sign a waiver, or maybe they'd have to sanitize themselves before, manufacturing a time for this encounter. And, people would not even be able to agree on like a day off in common to foster this culture of encounter, because everyone's hyper individualistic and I need all this day and I need that day. People don't have time to rest for a meal. And so it just really shows, I think, again, in stark contrast to our own society, what a culture of encounter demands. It demands slowing down. It demands, being attuned to care, being attuned to people, and not other things. Lastly, the joy of acknowledging others and recovering kindness. So, the Pope is so great at just his simplicity, his lightness, his joy. He really makes it all very very natural and very attractive, right? And it's genuine. You can tell in the way that he acts. So the joy of acknowledging others, it calls for the ability to recognize other people's right to be themselves and to be different. And, this genuine social encounter, it calls for dialogue that engages the culture shared by the majority of the population, but again, in a way that is not overbearing. And it requires a kind of humility, he says, to foster this, you realize you can't fight every battle. You don't have to, you need to concede on some things, some things have to be renounced for the common good. You don't possess all of the truth, or you can't satisfy every one of your desires. And genuine tolerance, not this kind of superficial tolerance where everyone kind of says like, you do your thing over there. That means accepting others, but without sacrificing your principles. And I think we recognize all of this. Again, I find most at peace and, a little joyful when you just kind of, accept and sit with something in, in a very simple way. And it's when you let pride in, which is, the deadliest sin, that, all of those things become more difficult. And, it's very attractive image the Pope has portrayed here. And again, lastly, recovering kindness. So he he again points here to features of the culture, consumerist individualism leading to great injustice. People become viewed simply as obstacles to our own ends, and we end up treating people as means. And kindness, very different in its orientation. Gentle, pleasant, and supportive, not rude or coarse. And, again, a common theme here is that it is very simple, but it is very difficult and that needs to be cultivated. Um, this takes time with people, to be kind. It's not just opening the door, right? It's the same person you meet every day and, in all of their difficulties and your own, kind of bearing with each other through that. And so to conclude, I'd say that we would do well to remember that the most important stuff in life does not necessarily come from very grand visions, strategies, committees, or in meetings, but in the everyday encounters we have with one another, and at the political and social level, an approach that is a little more down to earth and more based on slow processes of engagement and dialogue can bear much more fruit than in outcomes like all of the things that we find are in deficit today, like social capital, this idea of people having good relationships with one another, and trust. Trust is very low. Feelings of belonging. No one really feels like they belong anywhere now. You'd travel around. I don't belong anywhere. I can go anywhere. Nowhere is home. Higher civic participation. If people are simply doing more things together, we need that, and homemaking. And the other ideologies out there, they point to quantifying things that are markers for these things, right? Like impersonal variables like GDP, or abstractions like equity or inequality indices. These really don't get to the heart of things. And so I think, the Pope does very well in this to remember the call to be good neighbors, and as the Pope calls us to live it with the joy of the gospel. Thank you.